Welcome to the Eden Podcast, where we think again about the Bible on women and men, and we start with a correct understanding of what happened in the Garden of Eden back in the beginning. The work of the True 316 Foundation is based on the research of Dr. Joy Fleming, who wrote the book Man and Woman in Biblical Unity, Theology from Genesis 2 to 3. Listeners like you are joining us as members of the True 316 Foundation and support the work to true the verse of Genesis 3:16 and the 7 key passages on women and men. It turns out, when Genesis 3:16 becomes clear, all the other passages become clear too. You can learn more at our website, true316.com. That's TRU316.com. And at the end of this episode, we'll tell you about a special gift we have for new members. And now, enjoy today's episode of the Eden Podcast.
For Season 11 on the Eden Podcast, we're going back in time and playing audio that we've never played for you before. I was doing a private Zoom series of sessions with a number of students, and I used PowerPoint slides that I referred to as we went along. You can see these presentations in full on our YouTube channel. I'd love to have you subscribe. It's simply True 316. That's TRU316. And now, let's get started. Our workshop is entitled Women and Authority, 1 Corinthians 11, 10 to 16. This is part 2 of our study of verses 2 to 16. And I'm Bruce C.E. Fleming, your instructor. Our website is true316.com, TRU316.com, and Genesis316.com. It's great to get together. I love seeing my little grand twins and the way they like each other. The other day, I got a picture from our daughter who had the 2 girls coming forward across the field, and all on their own, they were just holding hands and kept holding their little hands all the way across, enjoying each other. And it's great to get together. All the times we get together in God's Word, we find that, I know you do too, in the body of Christ. I put a medallion on this screen, 1 Corinthians 11:10. This is the practical verse that really is the main application of this whole section. In verse 10, Paul first says, therefore. Then he speaks of women and authority. Finally, he says something about angels. This verse should make sense, but translations of it and explanations of it are faulty and make it very difficult to understand. We got into it a bit in the last workshop. We're going to come back for more right now. What is the reason for what Paul says here? Did this verse originally make good sense? It's time to think again about women and authority according to 1 Corinthians and the whole passage. So we got to start with verse 2. Some people don't start till verse 3. And we have to go up through verse 16. And we contrast that with what happens in verse 17, where he says, now I don't praise you. And he has some criticisms, but here he's praising them. What Paul said about women and men teaching and leading in worship had been adopted and practiced widely in Corinth. In verse 2, he praised them because they had done what he said. Now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firmly to the traditions, just as I delivered them to you. Some, though, afterwards had challenged this teaching, and he challenged them right back in this passage. What did they remember? What had the Christians been doing that he had taught them? In verse 3, he restated a basic doctrinal truth. Believers are united with Christ in one spiritual joint body, just as spouses are united in one joint body, and the members of the Trinity are united together. Christ is united with every believer, man or woman, just as he said in Ephesians 5:23, Christ is the head of the church and Christ being united in one body. And we've got the nifty little diagram that I've worked on many times. I'm not an artist or the son of an artist, but I try. So we have a little snowman here with a head and a long torso. If you look at the head, is that the body by itself? No. If we look at the torso, is that the body by itself? No. But the head, Christ, and the torso, the church, when you put them together, what do you get? One spiritual joint body. Yes, just like we talked about, the ant has 3 parts, but really it's just one body. So, our basic level of abstraction, when you talk about two parts of one body, you come up with a simple meaning that the two are united in one joint body. And so the principle of unity is established in this verse. He says, I want you to know that. And he says the main idea, the head of every man is Christ. And then he has two subordinate ideas to reinforce that, two illustrations. The head of a wife is the husband, the head of Christ is God. Wives, husbands, and heads. In Genesis 2, the woman was made as a help. In a previous workshop, we've seen that the Hebrew word for help means one who comes to the aid of another. Usually it's used for God who helps us. Psalm 121, verses 1 and 2. Making the pilgrimage up to Jerusalem, where God himself was worshipped, and yet on the hills on the way up, people were worshiping each individual godling that was worshipped, and these each one being in charge of his own hill. He says, I lift up my eyes to the hills. Is that where my help comes from? No. My help comes from God. Which God? Maker of heaven and earth. And from his excess strength, he helps us more than a dozen times. This word help refers to God in his great power who helps us, who don't have as much power. Sometimes the word help is used for a king who helps another king. In that case, he brings his help, his strength to the other who shares in strength, and together they get the victory. In no place, except in there's two places in Genesis 2, is the word help used for anything inferior. And yet people have been getting this wrong. Famously, Calvin talked about help being a cook's helper. Luther also had this idea. So do many others. Probably the best word to use for help in this case is partner. The husband and the wife and one joint body, and they're partners face to face with each other. In Genesis 3, the woman was not relegated to a lower place later on. There was no curse placed on her in Genesis 3:16, which is one of the things that we are trying to true up. People understand what Genesis 3:16 means. There was no curse placed on her, herself, nor on the ground or any place else, like for the man. In sin, the man dared to rule over her, trying to take God's rightful place over her. That's a different issue. Wives, husbands, and heads. When Paul gives his first of two additional word pictures in support of his main one in 1 Corinthians 11:3, he looks back and makes a proper interpretation of Genesis 2. Let us leave aside the many ancient and modern improper interpretations of the marriage relationship. We'll get back to that maybe some in a minute. Paul is picking up on the one flesh, joint body imagery of Genesis 2. In Eden, the married couple, joined by God, gloriously becomes one flesh in heart, in mind, and in body. And so we're getting a head start on the argument in 11:3. The church at Corinth had sent representatives and had compiled a letter to Paul spelling out specific questions and points of dispute among them. So there were reports from Chloe's people, and then there was a letter that he begins to pick up and respond to. In fact, 12 times he responds to each of these challenges using what's called a quotation refutation device. When I started my studies on these passages, I don't remember coming across that term, but it's pretty well understood now. A QRD, quotation refutation device. Some people claim that he uses this only for short slogans. But here in 1 Corinthians 11, and again in 1 Corinthians 14, he varies the pattern for his purpose. And let's look at these. 1 Corinthians 6:12a twice, 6:12b, 6:13, 7:1, 8:1, 8:8 twice, 10:23a, 10:23b, 11:4-6, and 14:34-35. You have this arc of ideas and great thought from chapters 11 through 14 with the love chapter in the middle, and these two quotations on either end, bookending the section. No believer, man or woman, should wear a sign of shame or separation on the head. Each has free access to God. I believe that's the tradition he's referring to. Some at Corinth challenged this, and he quotes their very words in verses 4-6. If you don't have quotation marks around your print copy of that, I encourage you to put your quotation marks, start with verse 4 and go through verse 6. Then, in verses 7 through 9, Paul theologically refutes the legalists who wanted to limit any woman who prayed and prophesied in church. At least in some way, where they got to put some extra limitations. They had all kinds of rules against women. First, Paul gives them, with verse 7, two good reasons why a man should follow the principles he taught. And the legalists even seem to give ground on this, at least in verse 4. The man, Adam, was created in the image of God. He was the glory of God. But then Paul builds on these two good reasons for the points of image and glory of God, and he applies it to woman. She too is the image and glory of God. Powerfully, Paul adds a third point in favor of woman, placing her in a favored position, not a subordinate position. Woman was also the glory of man. And the response of the man when she was created in Genesis 2 is clearly that. Anyone who rightly understands Genesis 2 sees the positive place of woman. All of this is contrary to the Pandora myths, etc. And we went over this in our first workshop, Think Again About Eve. Sadly, mistranslations and misunderstandings about women taint our reading of Paul's words in verse 9, but it doesn't have to. In verse 10, Paul makes theological application and gives his official marching orders for women serving as worship leaders and preachers in church. A woman has authority over her own head, meaning she should teach uncovered, or covered if she decides to do that too, I guess. Not all that hard to understand, is it? And yet, let's review how translations have worded verse 10. CEV, and so because of this, and also because of the angels, a woman ought to wear something on her head as a sign of her authority. If you look at that by itself, you might wonder why, but it seems to be clear. But contrast that with the TEV. On account of the angels, then, a woman should have a covering over her head to show she's under her husband's authority. So CEV, a sign of her authority. She had to wear something, but it was her authority. TEV, she's under her husband's authority. Living Bible, a woman should wear a covering on her head as a sign that she's under man's authority, a fact for all the angels to notice and rejoice in. New King James, for this reason, a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. New American Standard, therefore, woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head. All of them say on her head, as if it's a thing. The Greek word could be over, could be on. Here's the transliteration of the 13 Greek words. Therefore, or for this reason, ought the woman authority to have over her head because of the angels. Or, therefore, the woman ought to have authority over her head because of the angels. The last words of verse 10, we didn't get that this far in our last workshop, simply reinforce Paul's point, which you would expect. Therefore, a woman ought to have authority over her head because of the angels. And yet, people get really involved with this one. They have stories about angels hovering and how do they pray and how do they worship. And I have some good friends that just really get off on, get distracted and wander around with this one. And yet, I think it's pretty simple. If you look at a passage of the Bible and you have a couple of questions about a few key words, just back up a few paragraphs and see if there's any previous reference to what's going on. Well, I looked in chapter 10, didn't find anything about angels. 9, 8, 7, 6, the beginning of chapter 6, I found it. Paul's previous mention of angels came in chapter 6, where he referred to the authority all Christians have to judge angels. 6:1, if any of you has a dispute with another, dare you take it before the ungodly for judgment instead of before God's people? Verse 2, or do you not know that God's people will judge the world? And if you are to judge the world, are you not competent to judge trivial cases? Verse 3, do you not know that we will judge angels? I don't know how we'll judge them, but if they do a good job, maybe we can congratulate them and I don't know, honor them in some way someday. How much more the things of this life? Well, one of the things of this life that certainly women should have been able to judge was how should they cover themselves. In the verses before verse 10, so what's been happening up to verse 10. He's been talking about and interacting with Jews, the Jewish Christians, and their legalistic views, and trying to refute them based on the Jewish Old Testament. In the verses after verse 10, he appeals to the people of the church at large, 11 and 12, and then to the Greek or non-Jewish element of the church, verses 13 to 15. And I think the key to this is what he says in 1 Corinthians 10:32. There he appeals to three groups he has in mind. Some people have said, well, we've got a chiasm. We start with verses 2 and 3, we end up with 16, then we've got these verses and those, and they see a structure that rotates around verse 10. On that point, that's great. But when I try to apply this chiastic structure that they have, I don't see how these pieces fit with each other. Instead, I think they follow this 1, 2, 3 pattern quite clearly, talking to the Jews, talking to the church at large, and then talking to the Greeks. And so to the church in verses 11 and 12, he gives the basic teaching. Nevertheless, neither is man independent of woman, nor woman independent of man in the Lord. For as woman came from man, even so man also comes through woman, but all come from God. In these verses, Paul picks up two earlier strands of thought. Verse 11 restates the idea of unity that he talked about in verse 3. And verse 11 also lays the foundation for verse 12, which carries the thought from verse 9. The beginning of verse 11 and the beginning of verse 12 is important. In Greek, nevertheless, verse 11 typically concludes a discussion while emphasizing what's essential. So it's a given in Paul's mind. What he said in verse 10 is what they've been doing and what they should keep doing. In verse 12, the word for introduces a parallel thought to that. In these verses, Paul teaches that neither the Christian man nor the Christian woman can stand aloof on a different plane from the other. Together, they have the same point of reference for all things, God. They both are dependent on God. What counts in the church is God's point of view. Verse 11 concludes with, in the Lord. Verse 12 ends with, all things are of God. At the beginning of creation, God was over all. Among women and men in the Lord, this is still his place. And all this was said to support his teaching that women, like men who lead worship and preach, should not suffer the humiliation of putting a covering on their heads in accordance with the Jewish practice of wearing a sign of shameful distancing from the holy God. Nevertheless, look what others dare to assert, turning Paul's teaching on its head right here in this verse. I'm highlighting a few words from Calvin here. John Calvin says, let the woman be satisfied with her state of subjection and not take it amiss that she is made inferior to the more distinguished sex. This is in relationship to verses 11 and 12 that say nothing of that. But all things of God, he's trying to give us the commentary. Then he goes on, otherwise, they will both of them throw off the yoke of God, who has not without good reason appointed this distinction of ranks. Well, moving right along. To the Greeks, 1 Corinthians 11, 13 to 15. Thirdly, Paul appeals to the Jewish or the non-Jewish Christians. And if you've had trouble understanding what his passage was doing, then you have trouble trying to understand these verses. And people have been taking what I think is a simple Greek text statement, and they've been turning it into questions. If you look at your Bible translation, you're going to find, I think, questions at this point. But the Greek says this, you yourselves judge. It is proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered. You could even make it a question. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? And then 14, a statement. Not even nature itself teaches you that man is dishonored by long hair, nor if a woman wears her hair long, it's her glory, because long hair has been given to her instead of a covering. And so people get all hung up on this. What about nature? What about long hair? Short hair for a man, long hair for a woman? The Greek is declarative in verse 14 as I read it. Does not nature itself teach you, but nature itself does not teach you. I first came across this from Catherine Bushnell. When translating, the first choice is to take a declarative sentence at face value. If the words make sense that way, there's no reason to take them any other way. Verse 14, the men, among the non-Jews at Corinth, there was a variety of ways for men to wear their hair. Nearby to Corinth was the town mentioned in Homer's Odyssey, where he recruited a number of very brave, long-haired Achaeans. They came storming into town, got on their ships at the port right there at Corinth, and went off for the Battle of Troy. These heroes wore long hair. Now, at the time when Paul was writing, Romans and Greeks, the men, basically always wore their hair short. So is this an issue we want to get caught up in, tangled up in? How about verse 15, the women? Those who think Paul is advocating ideas about head covering in verses 5 and 6 have a hard time reconciling them with these latter verses. Walker observes in the JBL that these three verses, quote, actually imply rather strongly that women do not need any artificial head covering. Another way to test these verses is to see if the alternative way of translating them makes better sense. However, many troubles arise when an attempt is made to turn these statements into questions. Those who have modified verse 10 to, quote unquote, clarify its meanings, I think have modified these later verses as well. Here's a sample of several translations that make Paul's positive statements look like questions deserving negative answers. King James, verses 13 and 14. Judge in yourselves, is it comely that a woman pray unto God uncovered? Doth not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it's a shame to him? About the Living Bible. What do you yourselves really think about this? Is it right for a woman to pray in public without covering her head? Doesn't even instinct itself teach us a man with long hair tends to be ashamed? NIV, judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him? And so with these kind of translations, I grew up in church where all of the women, or at least most of the women, wore short hair, but they all wore hats, as if that solved the issue related of long hair that these verses raised. I grew up after World War II when the soldiers came home from the war, and for years they'd all had their hair cut short. And so they kept these crew cuts, and that was the manly way. That was the patriotic way for men to have short hair. Decades later, when Joy and I lived and ministered in Africa, we gained experience among people who were puzzled by what they read in their translations of 1 Corinthians 11, 13 to 15. For them, hair does not naturally fall in long, straight tresses for the women. So what were these verses saying to them? I think their response was similar to what the non-Jewish women at Corinth must have thought of the claims made by the Judaizers. What? These claims, saying it's a shame for a woman, she should have her head shorn, all that stuff was, strange to them. And so Paul turned to them and talked to them about their own experience. In verses 13 to 15, Paul argues that nature does not support the proposals of 4 to 6. To the Jewish legalists, a Christian woman's uncovered head might have looked as bad as if it were shorn like a prostitute's. But was this the way non-Jews saw these things? It was not. So to the Jews, any appeal to nature in these verses would have had no weight with them. They based their judgments on appeals to the Old Testament and the oral traditions of rabbinic authorities. But to the Greeks, these verses made sense. Appealing to nature was appropriate to them. Paul concludes his dialogue with the knowledge that some might not be convinced. There will be individuals genuinely converted to Christ who will still want to pick a fight with others, or as Paul says, be contentious. Paul appeals to them on two more grounds: his personal example and the example of other churches. At least the legalists in Corinth should admit that Paul had not taught what they wanted him to adopt. They needed to admit that he would not go along with them. The same would be true in the other churches. If they looked at what they were practicing in the other churches, they would see that their view was incorrect. Conclusion, verse 16. 1 Corinthians 11, 2-16 is an application of the principle that one does not have to become a Jew in order to be a Christian. The regulations that had become a hindrance in Judaism are laid aside by Paul as having no relevance to Christians, non-Jews, and Jews alike. Prompted by a proposal from the Corinthians embodied in the quotation in verses 4-6, Paul affirms his previous teaching that both male and female believers should minister in church, praying and prophesying, leading worship and preaching, without being limited by any of the restrictions of the oral law. In our present day, Christians need to be mindful of Paul's battle to keep women fully involved in ministry. Few people today would refer to the Jewish oral law in an attempt to limit the freedom of women ministering in church. But for their own reasons, many still try to draw a distinction between the service of Christian women and Christian men. If anyone wants to be contentious about this, Paul had no such custom, nor did the early churches of God, nor should the churches of today.
Thanks for listening to the Eden Podcast, brought to you by the members of the True 316 Foundation. Research into the Old and New Testaments by Dr. Joy Fleming and Reverend Bruce C.E. Fleming forms the base of all our work. Joy is a former Old Testament professor and is a practicing licensed psychologist. Bruce is the author of the Eden Book series, which starts with Book 1, the Book of Eden, Genesis 2-3. We invite you to become a donor member of the True 316 Foundation, as together we seek to true the verse of Genesis 3:16 and related passages. When you become a member, we'll send you an autographed copy of the Book of Eden. Sign up today by going to true316.com/member. That's TRU316.com/member.